all women are born with all the eggs that they're ever going to have. So when you take home a baby girl that's 1 day old from the hospital, she already has all the eggs she's ever going to have in her lifetime. It's not so much that the second you turn 35, something is going to happen to your eggs, they expire. No, like we really don't see kind of a higher risk until you're at least in your late 30s. I think egg freezing, like I've said before, is a really, really great insurance policy for the future.
There's a lot of takeaways, but for me, it's like, oh, there's this thing that Canada doesn't do automatically. I got to make sure I do it because it only costs $200. Welcome back, everyone. And I think we're both really excited for you all to listen to today's episode because we just finished a fantastic and very informative conversation with our guest, Vicky. As you all might know from the title, we're talking about a pretty relevant topic to folks in their 30s. So I'm actually going to put G on the spot right now. A lot of my female friends, they always sort of mention this timeline thing that they talk about, and or their fears and concerns about pregnancy, about whether the baby will be born healthy and stuff. So with first off, do you have a timeline, G?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, especially for females, I think we all know that there is more of a biological clock than for males. So, of course, and I think, a lot of the time that fear comes from when you're later in life, you just don't know what sort of implications or effects that it might have on the child, right? You don't know if that child is going to be healthy when you are conceiving or pregnant later in life. There's possibly more complications, things like that. But I feel like when my friends and I talk about it, that's as far as we go. Like, we're like, there's a biological clock. It's scary. It's coming. Like, that's it.
Yeah. And so that's actually something that I think was super helpful to talk about, not just like the freezing eggs or not freezing eggs thing, but the idea of, how is the health of your baby through pregnancy as they're a fetus, the developing fetus? How does that correlate to your age? What's this like 35 cutoff cliff that we often hear about? And it was illuminating because our guest, Vicky Hsieh, is an expert on this matter.
Vicky provided us with a lot of good information. She is a genetic counselor.
Currently the director of genetic services at the SUNY Downstate Medical Center in New York City. So she has a professional background as a genetic counselor and as a job sees patients through their screening and diagnostics for the prenatal health of their baby.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something that a lot of people think about, either because, of age, or because you might already know, like through your family history, that there could be complications or genetic concerns that you're like, well, I want to get checked out, but you might not have any idea how to do that. And I think she gave us a lot of information. Some of it, I admit, went over my head. I need to listen to it a second time to really understand.
So whether you are planning to have a baby or plan to have a baby again or are currently pregnant, I think this episode is definitely one that I'd be really excited for you to listen to. I learned a lot. I hope to have kids in the future. And so I'm going to, my partner and I, be like, okay, we got to do this and this because the Canadian healthcare system does not do it automatically. We got to ask for it.
Yeah.
Enjoy. Welcome, Vicky Hsieh, to That 30 Show. So excited to have you on today. And I think you're joining us all the way from New York City. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thanks so much. It's been a while since I connected with you. But when G and I were talking recently about common things that people in their 30s go through, pregnancy and everything that comes with that was a hot topic. And I was like, I know a friend in New York City who actually works in genetic counseling. I don't know, I'm probably butchering what industry and exactly how to represent it. And so we're both really, really excited to have you on today. Just to start us off, maybe give us all, because I have no idea anything about prenatal genetics, anything in that field. In a nutshell, what is your profession and what do you do? And tell us a bit about your path to get there, because we're always really interested about people in the 30s, how you got to where you are.
All right. Thanks, David. So I am a genetic counselor, a certified genetic counselor. What that means is I've completed a 2-year accredited master's program in human genetics or genetic counseling. And then we have to take a board exam to be accredited and certified. And basically, after that, we can work in any specialty of our choosing. So, right now, it's just the human genetics as a field. And we can go into mainly pediatric genetics, prenatal genetics, cancer genetics. But more and more, as the DNA testing technologies have gotten better, we've seen people in cardiology, we've seen people in things like ophthalmology. A really cool thing is in New York City, the coroner's office also has a genetic counselor to test people for genetic mutations after sudden death from stroke or cardiac arrest to see if they can potentially tell family members of their risk. And I have been here for 7 years.
That all sounds fascinating, and just like there's so many words that I probably don't even understand. Like I'm hearing you and it sounds so fancy because you're like a director of genetic counseling. Is there like something that you actually specialize in, or is it?
Yeah, I currently mainly do prenatal genetics and preconception genetics. I dabble a very little bit in pediatrics because I am the only genetic specialist in our hospital. So I will see kind of like one-off cases and just help offer testing or explain results to patients in pediatric cases. But my main patient-facing role is seeing pregnant women that have either a blood work anomaly or a sonogram anomaly and try to kind of go down the path to diagnose the fetus potentially and offering additional ways to change their pregnancies or whatever they want to do to guide them through the pregnancy.
So when you say that you're connecting with patients, and I'm sure we'll get into it from all the different angles in the coming hour, just off the bat, my first sort of curiosity is, are these patients taking these routine tests and it flags something of concern and then they are asked to connect with you, and or are they opting for optional screening and they're electing for optional screening and then they're coming to see you as a bonus because they have the financial means to get that insight?
Okay, so for my role, I mostly see patients that are going through routine screening and that have been flagged for numerous reasons. Occasionally, it would be no screening has been done yet, but they have a family history that they would like to be screened for. A little bit about where I work, SUNY Downstate. We are what we call a safety net hospital. So we work mainly with the underprivileged and underrepresented population. So we don't really do a lot of the high-end like private paying cases.
So I imagine I have a lot of friends who have kids. And actually, right off the bat, I should acknowledge that you are joining us after just putting your baby to sleep. So thank you so much. I know it's so hard to be a new mom. And congratulations. How old is your son again?
He is 8.5 months old, and I have not been at work for almost 9 months. So this is kind of warming myself up to go back to work too.
Yeah, I hear people on maternity leave often they're like, oh, I'm on my mummy brain right now. I'm like not even able to think about or say adult words anymore.
I know. It may be a problem for us, for you in post, but let's see.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, so like, friends like you and others have recently, I know as someone in their early mid 30s, a lot of friends are going through pregnancies or have given birth to their first or second child. So I imagine, would it be the case that all of these friends that I have, perhaps they've all gone through the same process that your clients have gone through in terms of the screening and potentially meeting with a genetic counselor, or is it a bit different in Canada?
Yeah, so I was actually going to point that out. Things are a little bit different in Canada as opposed to the United States. There is a little bit less kind of routine genetic testing in Canada than there is in the US, just because we are more of like a privatized healthcare system and every lab is trying to make money. Everyone is trying to kind of get the best new thing for all of their patients. So whereas in Canada, it's more of like a, universal healthcare system where everything is more like tiered and trickled. So for example, this is the biggest example that I know, which is when you go through a pregnancy, mmostly in Canada, a pregnant mother or a pregnant person would go through what they call a maternal serum screen, which essentially screens the pregnancy for things like Down syndrome, trisomy 13, and some minute other details, but they do so in Canada by using what we call maternal serum analytes. So they're more like placental hormones that's used to guess how healthy a fetus is. So it's not very specific. Whereas in the United States, we do something as a routine screen called the non-invasive prenatal screen, NIPS or NIPT for short, which directly gets fetal cell-free DNA from the maternal circulation to test for chromosomal defects. So this is very, very, very specific and highly, highly accurate. But in Canada, you wouldn't be getting this screening unless the first test has been flagged.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like there are some differences. Maybe like in the US, it's a little bit more proactive. And then in Canada, maybe it's like a second stage.
I feel like in Canada, it's more kind of everybody gets the same thing. And it has been shown in literature that doing what Canada is doing, which is what a lot of other nations are doing, will catch still most of the patients that need catching. We'll diagnose most of the fetuses that need diagnosing, whereas in the United States, it's more of a defensive medicine kind of practice that we have, where the fear is what if? What if we miss something that could have been detected by a different test?
I kind of want to turn to, I'm a woman in her 30s, and I feel like as I got older, maybe in my late 20s and early 30s, the topic of like having children comes up more and more, of course. And especially, we always talk about the pressure or fear of having children later in life, mostly because, we hear about these timelines and the ticking time bomb, as they like to scare us with, which is a very real thing. I'm wondering from like a genetic perspective, whether you have seen any correlation or if you have any other thoughts on having children later in life and possible genetic implications.
Yeah. So traditionally, we have used the word advanced maternal age to refer to women that are 35 or older. Sometimes if it's an older doctor, you'll see them kind of mention it in their charts, geriatric pregnancies. It sounds very scary. It sounds very, very scary. But you have to really think about the studies that were conducted to kind of put these women in advanced maternal age versus not advanced maternal age are mostly done in like the 50s to the 80s, right? So back in those days, women are generally having children younger, especially the first child. So it's not so much that the second you turn 35, something is going to happen to your eggs. They expire because that's expiration date, not at all. But the studies that are really robust, that have been replicated multiple times, have only grouped women into high advanced maternal age and not advanced maternal age. So it's kind of just like a cutoff, 35 or older or younger than 35. So it's really hard to untangle that a little and kind of move the goalpost up. But especially with the current like millennials having kids later, having your first child in the mid-30s, especially in a big city like New York City, is very common. And a practicing genetic counselor, we don't see like a cliff, like something happens at 35 and then just kind of dives off to like babies will have problems, you will have pregnancy issues. No, like we really don't see kind of a higher risk until you're at least in your late 30s. We kind of really think about more like 38 to 39. 40-year-olds are where we are currently thinking about moving the goalpost up to, because that's really where it will actually represent more of the high risk pregnancies, a really higher risk of birth defects, and a higher risk of chromosomal defects.
Whether it's 35 or 40, there is certainly a correlational / causational trend with age and the frequency of you potentially seeing clients because they have patients, because they have genetic anomalies and or concerns.
The real robust studies have definitely shown that the older you are when you're pregnant, so like kind of more gradually as you get older, there are higher risks to you kind of just health-wise for things like gestational diabetes, gestational hypertension. You may be more tired, like more morning sickness, just because your body is older. So that definitely happens. In terms of chromosomes and genetics, we definitely do also see this kind of, it's an exponential increase where the chances of a trisomy, so trisomy means a fetus or a pregnancy with different number, like a 3 chromosome in one. So aneuploidy means there's a different number of chromosomes. And aneuploidy happens when the sperm or the egg left an extra chromosome inside during division. And as women get older, there's definitely a higher chance of that egg having an extra or missing chromosome just because the egg sat longer in the woman's body before it was released. So little background biology there. All women are born with all the eggs that they're ever going to have. So when you take home a baby girl that's 1 day old from the hospital, she already has all the eggs she's ever going to have in her lifetime. So as she gets older, those eggs get older with her, right? And every month, only 1 or 2 mature egg gets released. So basically, the older you get, there's a higher chance that those eggs have sat in your ovaries for longer because it's waiting to divide and be released. So the longer it waits, the structure that holds those chromosomes together start to break down. So there's a higher chance it makes a mistake as a woman gets older. And yes, you start kind of seeing a tickle, like, the upward trend of risk starting at 35, but it doesn't really come up as an exponential curve until more like 39, 38.
That's Gee, did you know that about your body?
I didn't know that. And now I'm like, no, my eggs.
So biologically, that is what's happening. Whereas as opposed for sperm, right? The sperm, on the other hand, is made fresh daily, hourly, millions of them. So it's just a complete different mechanism with the sperm and the egg.
So interesting. And I feel like I want to very quickly take a quick detour and get your 2 cents on how you came to choose to be in this profession. Because these are very universal sort of questions and concerns that anyone who wants to, have kids will have. How did you personally come to be like, hey, I want to be a part of that process, but I want to be a part of those conversations?
So genetic counseling as a profession actually, I think, started in the late 60s when we were just kind of guessing based on family trees what's happening where. And it really, like you said, it really didn't take off until I was in grad school. So kind of the 2010s, where there's like a technology boom, is where we started getting more genetic testing. We actually understood more things can be seen because it's the completion of the Human Genome Project too, right, in the early 2000s. To be very honest, I became a genetic counselor because I applied to all different kinds of grad schools, medical school, pharmacy school, and genetic counseling school. And this was the only thing I got accepted into that was not in Vancouver. So I was like, why don't we leave Vancouver and go to New York City for 2 years and see what New York City is like? I didn't think too much about it, but my undergrad was in like a double major in psychology and genetics. So I applied because I qualified, like without doing anything else, I could apply. And after going through genetic counseling school, I definitely had a strong preference in pregnancies and reproduction, just because it felt to me like more things can be done and more choices could be offered to women.
Well, I mean, I don't blame you if you, I love Vancouver, but if I had the choice to study in New York City for a couple years, I would probably also take that. And it sounds like you had a real interest in it as well. So I'm sure it helps you understand, your own, like when you had your own pregnancy, I can only imagine like you're just like a pro at it.
It was a basket of cases. I knew at every stage what could go wrong. And I knew everything up until like 24, 25 weeks, because that's when I stopped seeing patients, right? Because I don't deliver patients. I don't deliver babies. I just kind of go through the like diagnostic journey of a pregnancy. And after 25 weeks, they're like, and how do you give birth again? Like, how does that happen? Now that we did all the tests, what happens next?
What happens after this? Yeah, it's definitely can be a double-edged sword, I suppose. I want to go back to you talking about the eggs. It's kind of funny. While you were talking about it, I was thinking of like a bakery where the sperm is like the fresh baked goods that come out every day, and the eggs are like the day-old bread that's like 50% discounted every morning. It was like, wow, this sounds sad. But speaking of like eggs and trying to preserve, I suppose, the health of the eggs, I know something that is talked about a lot. I don't know if it's because of age or it's because it's becoming more popular. But one of the things that is discussed a lot is IVF or other mechanisms to sort of freeze your eggs, preserve your eggs so that they're in good condition as you age. I know you specialize in genetics, but I was wondering if there's anything that you can enlighten us.
Yeah, so I think it's maybe a couple fold. For you, definitely because of your age, you probably are seeing more of that targeted ads now. B, there is kind of more of a like maturation of the field in general, because so the field we call assistive reproductive technologies, ART for short, is basically where anything happens outside the human body in the creation of an embryo. And egg freezing is like step one of that journey. Because IVF, assisted reproduction, has been happening for a lot longer now, there is a very robust way and a very robust mechanism in which we can harvest eggs. We'll call them like egg retrievals or egg freezing. And because the technology is quite mature, there is kind of a minimal risk associated these days. And it's now viewed as a very good kind of insurance policy against your future. Also, another kind of piece of the pie is the fact that this is a largely privatized industry, right? Companies are in it to make money. There is a lot of money to be made to scare women into doing something because the future is unknown. In terms of what I personally think about this, I think egg freezing, like I've said before, is a really, really great insurance policy for the future. I wouldn't recommend if you have a partner right now and you're thinking about trying to have a kid, you will go through egg freezing first and then try to have a kid. But if you are a woman that doesn't have a partner yet, knows that that's something that you would potentially like to consider in the future, and you're ticking towards that like 36, 37, 38 mark, it may not be a bad consideration, just something to have in case it doesn't work out well in the future. Then at least you have this like younger egg to kind of help you with the process.
Other than cost, are there any reasons to be hesitant or any drawbacks?
The biggest thing that comes to mind is something called ovarian overstimulation syndrome. So basically, whenever you go through egg retrieval, whether for IVF or just egg freezing, there is a course of hormones you have to take to basically stimulate your ovaries to maturing more eggs, right? So like I said before, generally every month in a woman's body through the menstrual cycle, usually only one mature egg is actually developed, that's released, and then that's the one egg that can be fertilized into a baby. But when we talk about egg freezing, egg retrievals, we want potentially 15, 20, 30, we want as many eggs as possible. And the only way to achieve that is to just basically inject hormones into maturing more eggs than what is typical. Because you don't want to go through egg retrieval 30 months in a row to get one at a time, right? You want to do this once, get as many as you can, and be done with it. So through the course of the hormone injections to stimulate the ovaries to be mature or the eggs to be mature, there is a risk of overstimulating that can cause an ovarian overstimulation syndrome that can be, it's scary. Like you will feel like you're hypertensive, you have a lot of fluid buildup, you can't breathe. It's really, really, really scary. It can potentially be life-threatening, but with potentially the risk of actually dying is very low, and the risk of it actually happening is decreasing as well as we've gotten to know better about hormones, how to use them, having more and more women gone through the process to kind of guess where the starting point should be. But there is definitely a potential risk here. And usually it would require a couple of days of hospitalization just to make sure all of your electrolytes get balanced back up before it can be discharged. So that is the only kind of physical drawback that really comes to mind. And obviously, like it's not comfortable. The like injections are not comfortable. The egg retrieval is not comfortable. But the actual risk, I will kind of tell patients, is the overstimulation syndrome.
Okay. But you wouldn't say that there is like a risk to, like, if you're actually trying to get pregnant later on, that there would be an implication to like that pregnancy?
Currently, the literature does not really show that correlation, but just from more like personal experience, it can take a while for your hormones to balance back out. And if it doesn't go well for the trying to conceive process, you may blame yourself for what you have done with the hormones. So there is no good, there's no good correlation that shows, doing this equals hard to get pregnant. There's no data that shows that, but just kind of as a more individualized, like patient to patient, I have definitely heard sentiments of, what if I have not done that? Would it be a lot easier for me?
Were you aware, G, of these potential risks? After hearing from Vicky about that, where do you stand, G? Do you think you would ever freeze your... As a very personal question, oh my gosh, why am I even asking that? But we're in the pod, so I'm going to ask it.
This is the juicy stuff. No, I liked how Vicky framed it as like an insurance policy. I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, it's not like anything, I don't know, it doesn't feel super taboo. Maybe in the past, but now it feels practical. I probably would wait until later, probably not right now. But yeah, I always thought that the cost was the main thing, because I hear it can get really expensive, and also that it is very painful. But other than that, it's helpful to know there's other side effects as well.
I appreciate you being able to speak to that, Vicky, even though it's not your expertise. So I guess going back to the prenatal screening genetic stuff that is your bread and butter. We mentioned earlier how you said that most, if not all, of the patients you see are a result of routine checks and routine screenings. Is there any auxiliary or additional optional stuff that expecting parents could do that will get them in front of a genetic counselor like yourself? Or is it all, I don't even need to think about that. If I'm going to have a baby, just do what I do at the hospital. That's going to cover all my bases if I want to understand the health of my fetus.
I think this is probably going to go back to like a Canadian versus United States difference as well. In the US currently, there is something called a carrier screen that is now becoming very routine. We screen for almost all recessive and X-linked conditions only, because we are not trying to diagnose anyone of any genetic condition they don't know about. When we do a carrier screen, the goal of the carrier screen is to see if mom and dad carry anything in common that can impact the potential child. So everything we screen for on here is recessive or X-linked.
So you're screening the genetics of the parents
to see if they could potentially together have a reproductive risk for a future offspring.
You're not testing the health of the fetus.
So this is something that I was trying to say. This is becoming very common in the United States, where a couple that is going to try to just marry is going to start to try to conceive, will go to the OB's office and say, hey, do I have to all clear to start trying? And the OB will order a carrier screen for them just to kind of get in front of it and make sure they know going in if there's any potential risks.
I was having conversations with friends about this where I don't know if it's just genetics, but any sort of pre-pregnancy health checkup / test is very culturally normalized and common in Asia, China, Hong Kong, for example, where I have a cultural background in. But in North America or Western societies, it's not as common. So maybe you're speaking to the fact that that's shifting in the States, where you can do more of these screening things that maybe people in China have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, you're on the right track. So this is actually the most common in the Jewish population, just because the Jewish population has a really high incidence of things like Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis. So this has been very, very common in that community for a very long time. So the culture is shifting in New York, where we're doing this for almost everyone that is newly pregnant, as soon as they find out they're pregnant or before they're pregnant. Whereas in Canada, I don't really see this as a big option yet. And when you were speaking about kind of in Asia, as far as I understand, it's kind of more like the Jewish screen again, where in Asia, they will screen you for things that are more kind of Chinese, common for the Chinese population. So things that come to mind are things like alpha and beta thalassemia, which is an anemic condition, which is very, very common in the Asian population. Things like G6PD, where it's very common for the Asian population as well.
What are some of the common genetic tests that are typically done these days?
So going through kind of just like a linear process of preconception to delivery, the first thing that you will think about is the carrier screen, right? Does mom and dad want to know if there's any potential risk to the fetus? And secondly, it would just be something more like the maternal serum screen that I talked about in Canada, or the non-invasive prenatal screen that screens for aneuploidy. So Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, anything kind of chromosomal related. And these mostly happen spontaneously. So they're not 95% of the time, they're not inherited. It's just an egg or the sperm made a mistake. And then after that, we kind of rely on more things like sonograms. So does the fetus meet all the markers of healthy growth? Do we see any skeletal anomalies? Do we see any cardiac anomalies? Do we see anything that's going to lead us to suspect a genetic condition? So sonograms are a really big part of what I do too. We see about 35% of patients because of sonogram anomalies. All of these are considered screening, right? The only thing that's diagnostic in a pregnancy is the process called the amniocentesis. So we take a needle and we draw some amniotic fluid from around the fetus, and we test that fetal DNA for actual genetic defects. So unless we can hold the fetal DNA in my hands and look for things, I don't know what the fetus has. I can only guess. And we will offer that based on whether or not we think there's a high likelihood of something going on. If I think the fetus could potentially have a high risk of a genetic condition, that's when the amniocentesis is offered. And then after a delivery, the last thing that kind of happens genetically is something called a newborn screen. So every state, every province is probably different, where there's a list of conditions that are going to be neonatal or pediatric childhood fatal unless we know about it and it can be treated. And they would test a newborn for them before they're discharged from the hospital.
So there aren't any other testings like in between the first kind of batch and then when they're born that would be more diagnostic, like not even when they're a bit more developed, like say at 7 or 8 months?
No, so after the 20-week anatomy scan, there is pretty much, so after about 16, 18 weeks, all the organs have developed in the fetus. So the rest of half the pregnancy is just getting bigger. So that's why the sonogram happens around that 20-week halfway mark, where we want to basically try to visualize every single organ to make sure there is nothing that's a concern.
The how do you pronounce that test again?
Amniocentesis.
Amniocentesis. That's the one that interests me the most. Is that like, let's say you have a very paranoid and or financially capable parent, and they're like, I want to do everything I can just to understand the situation and the health of my baby, if there's anything I can do. But it sounds like that's not really on demand. It's that you have to professionally be recommended it. Otherwise, it's not accessible.
In Canada, yes. In the US, if somebody walked in and say, I want an amniocentesis, we will do an amniocentesis.
Okay, so US is very much more capitalist.
Yes. If you want to do it, you can.
If you want to pay us money to do something, we'll do it.
In my hospital, they cannot have one unless they have been counseled for it, because the procedure is not without risk. When you are putting a needle through the amniotic sac, you always risk rupturing, which could lead to a miscarriage. So there is definitely a risk, but it's a small risk. We usually quote like a 0.5% risk of losing a pregnancy. So it's definitely like not a big risk at all. You do things that are more risky every day, like driving a car.
Got it. So I'm curious. We've talked a lot about, what you can do to diagnose and or screen for things. But the role of the genetic counselor, I imagine, is to talk to the patients at the point where they have found something. So at the various stages of screening, once you find something, obviously the main option that I'm aware of that not everyone is okay with, but it is medically an option, would be abortion at times. But walk me through, like, I find out there's a concern. Do I just not have a baby? If we are pregnant and we find something, well, what can I do about it?
Yeah, so it depends on what stage in the process you are. If this is preconception and we found out that both mom and dad carry the same genetic condition, then that would basically imply a 25% risk of a child inheriting both mutated copies because it's recessive, which means 75% chance you can still naturally make a healthy pregnancy, a healthy fetus. Their options would be to try to go through IVF and select for an embryo that does not have the mutation, because we can do what we call pre-implantation genetic testing, where the embryos are fertilized and we take a couple cells from the 5 or 6, 7 day stage and we test that DNA for the embryo's genetic makeup. So based on that, we can then tell you this embryo A is a boy, this embryo A is a carrier, this embryo B is a girl, this embryo B is affected, embryo C is a girl, embryo C is not a carrier. So we can know all of that based on genetic testing of the embryos before you decide which one you want to implant. So that is what can be done if we found something before you are pregnant. But a couple can also choose to go through a pregnancy naturally and do testing after it's conceived. And they can also choose to get pregnant naturally and do no testing. If we find something in a pregnant patient, so it's a fetus that's already existing, then like David says, the only option to stop the pregnancy is a termination. But there are options like adoptions. There are options like we can choose and plan to deliver in a hospital that has tertiary care that can provide the surgery the baby will need immediately after birth. Or if it's something that is treatable, we can, start getting insurance authorization, line up for treatments, or if they need special formula, we can kind of start getting that ball process rolling. So there are things that can be done, but the only black and white is, are we keeping this or are we not?
Can I ask what kind of procedure is it to do these genetic tests? Like, is it a blood test or is it, I don't even know what else?
Yeah, a carrier screen can be done through a blood test, where it can just like via saliva test. I can send a test tube to your house, and you spit in it, and then you mail it back, and you'll have the results in 2 to 3 weeks. In the pregnancy, both the serum screen and the NIPT, non-invasive prenatal screening, are both blood tests, and then sonogram is obviously a sonogram.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, to me, it just then makes sense to do it before you conceive, so that you kind of understand any sort of genetic risk that there might be, and then you might have a few more options at hand.
But they're not related, right? When we're doing a carrier screen, we're looking for recessive conditions that you were born with, that you got from your mom, your dad, your grandparents, just to make sure that the person that you choose, your partner, doesn't carry the same disease. Whereas in a serum screen or a non-invasive prenatal screen, we're screening for aneuploidies. There are random spontaneous events that happen with the sperm or the egg that causes the fetus of extra or missing chromosomes. So they're not related at all.
I can see how this, when you were getting pregnant, you're like thinking about all these things, because it's a lot to think about.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's say you just found out that you're pregnant, really excited, and then you're like anxious to understand as the weeks go by, is the fetus developing healthily? Is my baby healthy? Like, when do I get to know if there's any genetic and or chromosomal or whatever other biological term I don't know how to use, like anomalies or concerns? When do I get to know those things?
So generally speaking, once someone finds themselves pregnant, you will get your first sonogram between kind of like 8 and 10 weeks of pregnancy. And that's just to make sure that the embryo's in the right location, it's in the right size, it has a heartbeat. So this is called a viability sonogram, to make sure everything is going okay. And around 9 to 10 weeks is basically when we can do the non-invasive prenatal screen. So this one will test for chromosome anomalies and find out the fetal sex. And you bet I did my own blood test the second I turned out. And in Canada, the maternal serum screen is usually 2 parts, and the first part usually happens around 12 to 13 weeks, alongside something called the nuchal-translucency scan, which is a sonogram that measures, again, if the fetus is developing normally. And we try to look at this fluid collection behind the neck to make sure it's healthy. So this is actually a really, really good test to see if there are any major anomalies happening. Because if the fetus has a skeletal defect or a lymphatic system defect or a cardiac system defect, usually we'll see an increased fluid buildup behind the neck. And that will trigger a myriad of testing. So if you go through that, that's the first place where you're at the end of your first trimester. You've gone through the nuchal translucency scan, this is kind of the first time, personally, I would feel comfortable knowing that things are developing normally.
And I guess that's why it's common for folks to share and announce after the first trimester, because that's like where most of the risks could take place. Is that?
I will imagine so. And also the risk for spontaneous miscarriage is a lot higher until that point.
And so all those tests that you mentioned, again, I'm a slow learner, so I appreciate your patience. Those tests that you just mentioned at the various weeks, it will all happen automatically for me.
If you're in Canada, probably not. So the sonogram,
No.
yes. The sonogram, absolutely. You will probably be getting the 12-week nuchal translucency scan. That should be standard of care. And you will be getting that with the first part of the serum screen to make sure that the mom's pregnancy hormones are all balanced. There's nothing too high or too low. And that basically infers a healthy pregnancy.
So which one's not automatic again that I might have to?
The non-invasive prenatal screen. So the one where we can know the fetal sex and all the chromosomal makeup, that one is not standard in Canada yet. And that can be done as early as 9 weeks.
And now that I know that NIPS is a thing, in the future, if I am lucky enough to have a kid and it's around 8 or 9 months, can I go to the hospital clinic and be like, I want this, not 89 weeks?
You can. I think you definitely can do it. It just costs money. I think it's like $200 or $250. It's not expensive, but it costs money because it's not part of your like standardized care.
Okay, that's super helpful. Like I don't know if anything, like there's a lot of takeaways, but for me, it's like, oh, there's this thing that Canada doesn't do automatically. I got to make sure I do it because it only costs $200.
You can. You definitely can. You don't have to, but you can. And so a lot of my friends work for labs and they're like medical science liaisons for Canada because we're a lot of Canadians. And they basically just process samples coming from Canada. And it's really, really popular. Like these labs are making a killing in Canada.
This is such a good episode because I feel like there's a lot of things where I'm like, was someone going to tell me this at some point? Like if I went to a doctor at some point, were they going to tell me about all these tests?
I just want to say that the way, like just doing the standard flow is not wrong. Just doing the standard flow will eventually still catch pregnancies that need diagnosing. But for those, high anxiety parents, for those that maybe have other risk factors, it may just be helpful to know things a little bit earlier so they can plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking more about, of course, there's more high anxiety parents, but for those in particular who have, family history of health issues and things like that, I would imagine that those people would be more inclined to do some additional tests just to find out about anything that could happen. You mentioned that the test is like saliva or blood sample. Are there any tests that you can just like purchase from a website or like any brands? I'm thinking specifically like things like 23andMe. I know that's sort of more of an ancestry test, but are there tests like that for genetics that you can just like purchase and send in a saliva sample and you can get an idea of any sort of genetic concerns?
Yeah. So companies like 23andMe actually also offer on the side like a health information portion. So they do ancestry testing and they also offer health information. And they will test you for things like breast cancer risks. They will test you for some carrier conditions, but it's in no ways comprehensive.
Is there anything that you're seeing in your field, trends or technologies in genetics that could, help either support diagnostic procedures or processes or impact any sort of prenatal pediatric care in the next few years? Anything interesting that?
I guess this is also kind of a twofold question or a twofold answer. The first is absolutely there's something called gene editing, right? Like we can now deliver genetic cures by fixing the genetic mistake. And that has actually already happened for a handful of diseases. And that's the conditions that I'm helping test for in the hospital in the pediatric side because we can cure them. So the biggest thing or the biggest push right now is a genetic condition called spinal muscular atrophy, which is a muscle paralysis condition. And we can now deliver a gene therapy to basically give you the protein, the enzyme that you're missing so your muscles will not atrophy. And as CRISPR gene editing becomes more and more mature, we in the genetics field are hoping that a couple of decades from now, all genetic diseases can be cured from gene therapy. So that's exciting, but that's kind of we're still working on it. We're still working out the kinks. And on kind of like the prenatal side of things, there's always been this holy grail of genetic testing in pregnancy, and it's something called a maternal trophoblast cell. So basically, when you are pregnant, when a person is pregnant, in the circulation of the pregnant person, there is actually actual fetal cells, but the concentration is 1 in a million. So in a million cells, there's one cell that comes from the fetus directly. And that cell contains fetal DNA, right? So if there is a way of taking blood and finding that trophoblast cell, we don't need the amniocentesis. We can non-invasively look for the fetal DNA through maternal blood. And there was actually a company that said that they could do this, like 2-3 years ago. They started offering this as an option, and we were all very, very excited. But the company no longer exists because their success rates were 50%-ish.
Oh.
So that's the holy grail. The theory works. It's just a matter of how do we get that stuff? How do we tag it and find it consistently? Like once we can do that, we can test for all genetic conditions through maternal blood.
Wow. What do you think is the timeline for that?
I still think it's close. So I actually almost did it for myself when I was pregnant, just because I wanted to know. And that's when the company told me their success rates are really low and they're probably about to go under.
Time for you to start a company, Vicky.
I don't think I can mention. But I would think in the next 5 to 10 years, it's probably going to be more mature, and it's probably going to take another 5 to 10 years for it to become commonplace.
Gee, I know that in the future, I think you are interested to have kids. From everything that you've heard, like in a nutshell, like do you think you're going to do anything differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think I learned a lot. I'm still trying to digest all the information. This is definitely one of those episodes that will have to like re-listen and try to see what I can pick out every time I listen. But in terms of the tests, those are some of the things that I had no idea that we should be doing. I always felt like, oh, we're in Canada, like we'll get these tests automatically because it's like the free healthcare or whatever. But I guess not like that. One question, I don't know if it's sort of wrap it up, but our show is all about people being in your 30s, and so people who are thinking about having children or maybe who are newly pregnant, like, any sort of advice from your perspective for them, like if there was like one piece of advice that you could give them.
I think my piece of advice is to just have a plan. So if you are someone that has a partner and you are thinking about having children together, it's very beneficial to start kind of have a conversation. Just, open up a bottle of wine one night, instead of game night, watch a movie, spend that hour and a half talking to each other about where you each draw the line, right? This is what I will want to do if this happened. What would you do if we found out, we couldn't have kids? How far into the IVF journey would you want to go? Or if we found out the baby has any sort of defects or deficits, how far are we willing to accept that? Or when are we going to choose termination? These are just conversations that's really good to start before something happens. So A, where each other stands, and B, when something does happen, you're not also taking an additional 3 weeks just to like communicate that with each other, because you're also going through all the emotions. And if you're someone that doesn't have a partner yet, and you're someone that wants to have children, just think about kind of what that would look like for you if it's something that you absolutely must have in order to live a fulfilled life. Or are you more so, like, let's just see where my life goes, because that's where you will start thinking about whether or not egg freezing is something that is right for you. So in terms of all these genetic things, you just have to be honest with yourself and with your partner what you truly want, and just think about it.
Wow. Okay. I really like that advice, because one, I think when you're in it, like if you don't have a plan and if you haven't thought this out, like you said, the emotions in the moment might kind of take over and put blinders on you. And the other thing is, like, I feel like sometimes these things, as we get older, it's like things that we don't really want to think about, right? Like genetic testing, like we might get bad results. You never know what's going to happen. And then IVF is something that's like, you know, it might be expensive, it might be painful. And you're just like, I don't want to think about this. I might put it off. But you can only put it off for so long, I suppose, until you actually have to face it. And so thinking about it in advance is probably going to be really beneficial for you in the future.
Yeah, at least just to kind of know where each other draws a line, right? For me and my partner, we talked about how we will do everything up to intrauterine insemination. I will not do IVF because I don't want to do the hormonal stimulations before we started trying for a baby. And in terms of like having a pregnancy, we talked about, you know, what genetic conditions are absolutely no's for us and what are the things that we will kind of deal with as it happens.
Yeah, I also really like that advice because something that we haven't really touched upon in this conversation or acknowledged is that, at least from my perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I think once you are presented with information about potential anomalies, complications, concerns, it goes really quickly from a biological sort of conversation or genetic conversation to one of morals and values, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like, as you said, what kind of genetic situations or I don't know what are acceptable or not acceptable. And that's a very personal and moral question that only each person can make based on their own principles.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't, yeah, it's a great point. I can't imagine being faced with a decision and then be like, oh, we've never talked about this. And then one partner being like, no, I want to raise a kid no matter how hard it's going to be. And then the other partner is like, no, I don't think we're not going to be able to.
Yeah, like the financial, the time spent, like there's a lot that goes into it. So in terms of that as well, in a pregnancy, you're also racing against the clock because there's always, no matter where you are, a deadline as to which a termination can occur by. Because after a fetus reaches viability, there is no more option for termination because technically that is a person that can exist outside of the womb. So you don't want to be kind of rushed against the ticking time clock that is a pregnancy and having not had those conversations. But at the very end, I also just do want to add and point out that almost all pregnancies, most pregnancies are healthy. Most children, most babies are healthy. What we are seeing, what I am seeing in the clinic is the anomaly because I am only seeing patients that have issues. There's so many OB patients I don't see because there's no issues, right? So these are things that are good to have, but I wouldn't really want people to focus too much on it or having too much anxiety on it because most likely it's going to be fine.
That's a good reminder. Thanks for bringing us back. We're like deep in the weeds of like, oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a...
Well, speaking of, the patients that you do talk to, the last question I want to ask is, I imagine all of those conversations are maybe all of them are difficult ones. The patients you're seeing, they're having to wrangle and to face some difficult decisions. But I also imagine, as in the role of being a genetic counselor, you really help patients navigate those difficult decisions. Is there a story or anecdote or moment that you remember that kind of stands out where your role as a genetic counselor really made a significant difference for a family? I know you make a difference for all families, but like something that you remember that you always think fondly of.
Yeah. So this is actually the part of my job that I love, right? Like I don't love seeing fetuses that may have potential issues. I don't love seeing patients that are going through such a hard time. But what I really, really, really enjoy is being able to communicate with them, listen to what they are saying, what they're really feeling, and try to get to a place where they can make a decision about their pregnancy. And the biggest component of that is just listening. I saw a patient maybe like a year ago now, because I haven't been working for almost a year, maybe like a year and a half ago now, where it was quite a routine finding. Like nothing, in my opinion, nothing was going to be wrong. It's just we'll do a little extra testing because something was flagged, but in my opinion was not a big deal. So I was communicating that to her, but like the whole time, what I was hearing is how devastated she is that she is pregnant. And she came from a different country. She did not grow up in the US. English is a second language. and she already has 5 kids. This is her 6th pregnancy. And I was trying to communicate to her how not big of a deal the finding actually is. All I hear is how devastated that she was pregnant again. So then I just kind of shifted the conversation to, did you know in New York you can have an abortion? And she looked at me like, I can have an abortion? Like nobody, how come nobody told me I could do this? I have been saying I don't want this baby since I found out I was pregnant. I thought I had no choice. So she electively went to have an abortion, and she started calling me every day, not every week, for almost like maybe like 6-7 weeks, just on the phone, thanking me because she felt so good that she could make that choice for herself and her family, because she could not handle another child. She just didn't know that was an option. Afterwards, I saw her a few weeks later after like everything has gone and passed, and we talked about contraceptive. She can have IUDs, she can have her tubes tied, and she's like, how come nobody talked to me about these things? I don't want any more children. Take my uterus out. And she's just never been educated on her rights in New York. Like, these are things she can choose to do. So the biggest thing, like, it's not really about what patient chooses, it's just about choosing the right thing that is right for them at the time.
You're really empowering them with options, especially in this case, options they didn't even know they had, which is as life-changing as it gets, right?
I will assume people knew about that, but you can't assume things.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've learned a lot this episode, and I think Vicky really helped enlighten us on a lot of things that I didn't know, at least, and I'm sure people listening would be interested to know and didn't know before. So I just want to thank you for your time. You have a fairly newborn, so the fact that you're able to take some time out from your weekend, we really, really appreciate it. And all the knowledge that you brought is very valuable.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you like our show, support us by giving us a rating on Spotify, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, or subscribing and following That 30 Show on your favorite platform. If you have any feedback or questions, definitely reach out to us on Instagram. We're at That30showpod, or you can also email us at That30showpod@gmail.com. We would absolutely love to hear from you.